One thing that always interests me is outliers in the discography of popular bands, particularly when those outliers represent a more artistic or more creative variation on their normal thing. An attempt to reveal subtle artistic ambition on the part of a band mainly defined by other qualities. Now, Dire Straits get a lot of attention for a certain small number of singles that are ubiquitous on classic rock radio. But if you get away from the hits, they can be much more ambitious than you'd expect. I've never had a sense from listening to Dire Straits that the main songwriter Mark Knopfler was influenced by or paying attention to progressive rock, but there are at least a couple of songs or times where he's independently arrived at a similar set of musical values. Most notably in the case of the 15-minute epic Telegraph Road, but also in the instance that I want to talk about today, which involves sneaking a strikingly bleak song cycle about war into their most commercially successful album. As always, I'm Hans from Electric Brain Electric Shadow, a contemporary art rock project focused on atmosphere and melody. You can find us on Bandcamp or your favorite streaming service, or look up one of our album playlists here on YouTube. Now, I should admit here that perhaps saying he snuck it isn't the most appropriate verb because the topic of war is right there in the title. But the cover image of a shiny guitar floating in a blue sky, lovely and iconic as it is, makes no sense relative to that album title unless perhaps you transpose that phrase from war into perhaps a metaphor for bandmates, which wouldn't make a whole lot of sense really given that all the original members of Dire Straits had departed at this point. It's also a sneak to the extent that public perception of this album has often been dominated by the trio of hit singles at its beginning. Now, I hope I'm not going to upset any Dire Straits fans who might be watching this by saying that I really don't love Money for Nothing or Walk of Life. I can honestly probably also live without So Far Away From Me. And if anyone's watching this who doesn't like those songs, I'd say don't allow that dislike to dissuade you from checking out the whole album. I do respect their craft as well-produced pop rock songs, but they're really not my sort of thing. And to me, they're really notable mainly as kind of almost a bait for the remainder of the album, which goes into much more intriguing territory. Now, you can divide this album roughly into uneven thirds, the first third being the hits that I just mentioned, the middle third being taken up with Your Latest Trick and Why Worry, both quieter, moodier, jazz-inflected songs. This album is famous for being the first to sell 1 million copies in CD format, so it's interesting to me that both Your Latest Trick and Why Worry include additional instrumental material in the CD version that isn't on the vinyl, with Why Worry being expanded up to 9 minutes in length. One thing that the CD era became known for was increased album scale in ways which sometimes resulted in a sense of bloat. And while the additional material works well in these two songs, it's interesting that the album, which did probably as much as anything else to really establish the dominance of that format, also immediately began using it to push toward expansion. Those two songs aren't really the focus of this video, but as long as I'm on the topic of this album, I really didn't want to let it pass without making that point. It's the last 4 songs, though, or side 2 of the vinyl, that I'm most interested in today. There's a switch here from a relatively light, humorous tone of the first half to something much darker and moodier, and interestingly, 3 of the 4 songs on the back half of the album are explicitly concerned with war and with the suffering that it brings. There's also a 4th which goes out of its way to touch on that issue, despite not being explicitly about it. I used the term song cycle in the title of this video because, of course, this isn't a concept album so much as kind of a concept side, right? A miniature, near-concept album concentrated within something whose overall reputation is probably in most people's eyes defined by, and certainly whose success is primarily caused by, the lighter material in the first half. Now, Knopfler has said that the title track in particular was inspired by the Falklands War, so in a way, you can kind of think of this as an analog to Pink Floyd's The Final Cut, and Roger Waters' thought about the Falklands War on that album, although, of course, that is seen as an outlier in their catalog in a much different way than this is, which has kind of become like the archetypical Dire Straits album, despite being rather unusual in the ways I'm going to talk about. The first track in that war sequence is Ride Across the River, which instrumentally sits atop a dark murk of synthesizer that in places reminds me almost of something Peter Gabriel would have done maybe on Security. Although the omnipresence of Knopfler's guitar leads and his distinctive voice mean that you certainly would never confuse it for a Peter Gabriel song. Lyrically, the first verse is narrated by a dedicated soldier of freedom, the second by a cynical soldier of fortune, and in the contrast between those two characters, the theme becomes the way that war eliminates the distinction between idealists and mercenaries, where ultimately both groups have to ride across the river. The river here being the boundary that separates normal life from the brutality of war, where, as Knopfler says, right becomes wrong, left becomes right, which is maybe a less vivid description than I would have preferred, but that's the only critique I really can make of what's otherwise a conceptually rich, imagistic lyric that sits atop a sonically really fascinating track. Following that is The Man's Too Strong, which is one of the most lyrically slippery songs Knopfler's ever written. The main character calls himself an aging drummer boy who's now being accused of being a war criminal. But, even though he minimizes his role in the first couple lines, in the next breath he's claiming the actions of a cult leader, saying that he's legalized robbery, called it belief, rewritten history with armies and crooks. Despite that power, which seems really remarkable in its scale in one moment and tiny in the next, he's ultimately tried and sentenced by a sort of omnipotent figure who, verbally at least, humiliates him sexually. Ultimately, this protagonist stands in for every villain who's ever been outdone by a greater villain, right? Every sadistic KGB agent who's been executed by a Stalinist regime, or anyone else who's tried to thrive by participating in a system that oppresses others before finally being outdone and then done in by it. Dire Straits in this era are underrated as sonic texturists, and one of the things that's become interesting to me over time is the way this album blends synthesizers and other 80s production touches with the roots rock aesthetic of their earlier work, in a surprisingly cohesive way which often feels less dated than many other 70s artists' experiments with 80s production. The sound palette on this song is equally split between acoustic strumming and a kind of Ry Cooder-ish slide lead on the one hand, and wells of slow-release pads, with the most interesting bit being the build-up to the instrumental refrain following the title phrase. The man's too big, the man's too strong. The next track, One World, seems at first glance like the odd one out here, with its faster tempo, its lighter tone, its lyrical focus on a more trivial set of concerns. Knopfler can't get any sleeves for his records, which until very recently I misheard as a songwriter's complaint of can't get any sleeves for my records, which I think is actually a more interesting lyric. But it's telling that the title of the song is emphasized in the last line of the last verse. I can't find a way to be one world in harmony. Despite the narrator's litany of more pedestrian issues, the ultimate focus is on geopolitical strife, which, if nothing else, I think suggests a clear awareness of the conceptual arc of the second side, right? And the need to somehow fit this track into it, even if it doesn't naturally seem to go there. As an aside, my favorite part of this song is the harpsichord-driven middle eight. They tell me that's what everybody knows. Which fits in a surprisingly cohesive way despite not really making sense on paper, does a lot to elevate and distinguish what's otherwise a fairly run-of-the-mill Dire Straits song. Now, my sense is that some people find Knopfler cold and inauthentic as a writer, as a singer. He's often doing character sketches, which come with a smirk and a sense of dramatic remove. And I can totally see that criticism in the context of something like Money for Nothing, which, if it were a person instead of a song, would have that kind of Ted Cruz-ish quality where you feel an urgent and persistent and inexplicable need to punch its teeth in. And in the title track, which closes the album, he's playing a character just as much as he is anywhere else, right? He's obviously even less connected to a soldier from a lowland farm than he would be to an appliance installer who's jealous of rock stars. And yet, the rich beauty of this final track has always been so moving to me, so deeply, more for the sake of its melody and sound than for the specifics of the lyric. Although the theme here does present an interesting inversion of Ride Across the River, where that track dealt with the way that war brings different types of people together into nightmare. This track discusses the brotherhood of warriors.
We're fools to make war on our brothers in arms.
So overall, I think that this is a really interesting, fascinating, surprisingly experimental and dark and conceptually unified set of tracks that is kind of hiding in plain sight in the back half of an album that, from what I can tell, seems to be much better known for the lighter fare in its first half. All right, thank you much for listening to my thoughts. Hope everybody has a good week, and I'll see you soon.